Today I'm going to be making a cropped patchwork puff sleeve blouse, and in this video I'm going to be showing you my process of designing and sewing this patchwork blouse. It's my first time doing a patchwork design and I hope I don't overthink it. For this project, I'm working with the vintage 1970s sewing pattern and using it as a template for my design. I've only sewn this pattern once, but it's actually my favorite puff sleeve dress pattern ever. I've talked about it in an earlier top 5 summer dress video. I just love the volume of the sleeves. I love how comfortable it is. I love how easy it is for me to put it on and take it off because of the elasticized neckline and empire waistline. For this blouse, I'm going for a cropped length for a classic summer look, so I know I can use the empire waistline of this sewing pattern as a guide for deciding how long I need the blouse to be. Now, based on how the dress fits me right now, I know I can't just take that empire waistline because it sits exactly under my bust right now. It's fine as a dress, but as a blouse on its own, I know when I raise my hand, it's gonna boop. So the only change that I'm making to the sewing pattern is just using the bodice and then lengthening it by 1.5 inches below the current empire waistline. My design goal for this patchwork blouse is for it to be the perfect match for this pair of shorts, which is a key piece in this citrus-inspired summer capsule. And for my explanation of my approach towards designing the patchwork blouse to make sense, I'm gonna have to go through a few key design features of this pair of shorts. I actually used 2 different fabrics in the same design collection to make this one pair of shorts. I used a striped fabric and I cut it in a certain way to make the stripes actually converge at the waist. Kind of like a visual play / optical illusion kind of a thing going on. I want to use the phrase visual flow, kind of like how the lines are flowing with my body when I wear this pair of shorts, from the hips to the waist like this, and the lines are going like this. If you know a better phrase to use than visual flow, leave a comment and let me know. So I mixed this striped fabric with another fabric, and for the second fabric I actually cut it in a way that creates like a wide decorative border for this pair of shorts. So here's how I'm going to be applying these same design concepts to my patchwork blouse. Instead of cutting squares like a lot of patchwork designs that I've seen, I'm gonna be cutting fabric strips and then sewing them together to make a striped patchwork fabric for my blouse. In terms of applying the concept of visual flow, it made sense for me to make the stripes converge from the hips to the waist in this manner, following the outline of my body. But when it comes to the design of the patchwork puff sleeve blouse, it's more about the roundness of the body and the volume of the puff sleeve. So the round lines is what I'm gonna be accentuating instead. And to do that, I'm gonna actually cut the fabric strips in different widths. So the patchwork blouse is definitely a little bit more dramatic than my design for the short. So instead of mixing just 2 prints, I'm gonna be mixing a whole bunch of different colors and prints, but still adhering to the color palette that I've picked for this citrus-inspired summer lookbook. Let's get started with pattern making and sewing. So here's how I'm making up the pattern and cutting my fabric for making this patchwork blouse. There are just 3 pattern pieces for this design: the sleeve, the front bodice, and the back bodice. I'm gonna explain my process by using the bodice front pattern piece as an example. I started off by pressing all the pattern pieces so I will have a nice and smooth pattern to work with. Then I traced the pattern out on butcher's paper, which has been just a cheap alternative to regular dressmaking drafting paper for me. This is the paper that I've been using whenever I am making my own design and doing flat pattern making. This pattern piece is the bodice front, and it's supposed to be cut on the fold, which is why it's just half of the whole bodice front. But to help myself visualize and plan out the patchwork pieces better, I also drew the other half of the bodice front by mirroring and tracing the pattern piece a second time. Next, I planned out my stripe placement to create that optical play of having a fuller, rounder, puffy top. I started with the 2-inch wide rectangle in the middle, and then I moved to the side with a 1.5-inch wide rectangle. I drew 2 1.5-inch wide rectangles, then 3 1.25 inches wide rectangles, and then 4 1-inch wide rectangles. The rectangles on the ends ended up being narrower than 1 inch, but that's okay. I applied the same concept for all the pattern pieces, and this is my patchwork fabric plan for all the pattern pieces. So this whole process of drawing the rectangles over the pattern pieces is really just a way for me to figure out a number of different things. Number one, how many rectangles I need for each pattern piece. Number two, what are the lengths and widths of each rectangle that I need to cut and sew to make the patchwork fabric piece for each pattern piece. In general, the length of each rectangle is the longest point of each pattern piece, and the width of each rectangle is the width that I want the final rectangle to be, plus a 1/4 inch on each side for seam allowance for sewing the strips of fabric together to make the patchwork fabric. So for example, the longest point of the bodice front pattern piece is actually 10.5 inches. So the length of each rectangle that I cut to make the patchwork strips for the bodice front pattern piece ended up being 12 inches each. So before I commit to cutting the fabrics, I need to decide on the best layout, or rather order and combination of the different fabrics that I want to use. What I've done is I have taken pictures of the fabrics that I'm going to be using, and I've uploaded them onto Illustrator, and I'm here right now clipping the fabrics into the different shapes of the pattern pieces and rearranging them to try to figure out my favorite combination. It's taken me a while now, and I am trying not to overthink it. After much deliberation, this is the final layout of the patchwork fabric pieces that I decided to make for each pattern piece. The top pattern piece here is the bodice front, and the bottom piece is the bodice back. And here is the layout I decided for the sleeve pattern piece. And now it's finally time to start cutting the fabrics. If you plan on doing a design like this, I highly recommend having the rectangles on your design plan numbered and having the calculations completed and printed out beforehand. When cutting the fabric, I had to refer to my fabric plan and calculations back and forth quite a bit, so having it just available for me to refer to on hand was super helpful. And now we start sewing. To make the process of sewing the rectangles less confusing, I made sure I had my rectangles stacked in the order that I needed to sew them. And then I simply worked my way through sewing the individual rectangles together at my sewing machine. Over here, I'm actually working on both the patchwork fabric for the front and the back at the same time. You can see me alternating between sewing the rectangles for creating the patchwork fabric for the front and back bodice pieces, and I like this method of doing the continuous stitching because this helps me to avoid having the long tails of thread at the end of each stitching and helps to eliminate thread waste. I also had my patchwork plan taped on the window in front of me so I could check my work while sewing and make sure I have the fabric pieces stitched together in the right order. Once I was done with sewing the rectangles together, I trimmed the 1/4 inch seam allowance in half and then finished the seam with a small zigzag stitch to prevent the raw edge from fraying. If I had a serger, I could have probably done this step in half the time. So after finishing the edges with zigzag stitches, I pressed each seam flat so the entire patchwork fabric looks nice and neat. So I finished sewing my patchwork fabric pieces. The next thing that I need to do is cut the pattern pieces out. I'm gonna put the pattern pieces over the patchwork fabric piece. Make sure it's kind of lined up the way that I want it to look. Now this is where it gets a little bit complicated. I can't simply trace the pattern out and cut the shape out, because then all the patchwork strips are just gonna start unraveling. So to overcome that problem, I'm gonna have to trace the outline of the pattern, then sew tiny zigzag stitches right next to the outline, then cut the outline out. This is one of the instances where having a serger would have made my life so much easier, because I could have just simply traced the outline and then sew it with the serger, and the serger would finish the raw edge and cut the outline for me at the same time. Now, if you're sewing this without a serger as well, this is my little trick for making sure that your zigzag stitches sit nicely right next to the traced outline of the pattern piece. Now, based on the width of the zigzag stitches that I've picked, I know that the needle will enter the work on the right side, right where the right side of the presser foot opening is. So to make sure that this zigzag stitch sits right next to the outline, all I have to do is make sure that while I'm sewing visually, I line up the traced outline along the right side of the presser foot opening. Okay, so before I move on to showing you how I put the blouse together, I just want to tell you that I made some math mistake when calculating the width of the fabric strips that I needed to cut to make the sleeve pieces. So I ended up having to actually slice the sleeve pattern piece right in the middle and then adding more strips to make up the width that I needed for the sleeves. I even ended up having to piece fabric together because I just didn't have enough of that print to make one continuous strip. So it's not perfect, but it's gonna work out. To sew the blouse together, I started off by sewing the sleeve pieces to both the front and back bodice pieces along the raglan seams first. Then after that, I folded the blouse in half, matching the front and back along the side seams and lining up the underarm seam of each sleeve. And since I had already gone through all that trouble of making tiny 1/8 inch wide seam allowance when sewing the patchwork fabric, I did the same here. It is a lot of cutting, a lot of trimming, a lot of zigzags. And finally, I made elastic casing along the blouse hem, the sleeve hem, and neckline for inserting the elastic. I made the elastic casing just about 1/8 inch wider than the width of the elastic I used. I used a 1/4 inch wide elastic along the neckline and around the sleeves, and a 1/2 inch wide elastic around the waist. I just felt like it would be a good idea to have something more sturdy around the waist. I inserted my elastic into the casings with a good old safety pin, and this is how my patchwork blouse turned out. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that I had a math problem that resulted in some issues with the sleeve pieces that I cut and sewed. And that's because I was overthinking and I used a rather silly method of trying to cut and sew the sleeve pieces. I feel like it was too complicated for me to try to explain it in the middle of the video, but what I actually did was I actually made individual pattern pieces for each fabric strip that I was gonna cut and sew. So I took the sleeve pattern piece, I sliced it into the strips with the different widths to make new pattern shapes, and then I added seam allowance around the new pattern shapes to make the pattern pieces. I wanted to try this method because I thought this would help reduce the amount of fabric waste from cutting the strips to make this patchwork blouse. But in hindsight, I feel like the time and effort that's needed to create the individual pattern pieces far outweighs the problem of creating fabric waste for this project. So did my idea of having the fabric strips in different widths work in having that optical illusion and visual play? It is hard to say because I don't have another blouse made with the same fabrics, with the only difference being having all the fabric strips in the same width. So there's no way to compare it. At the end of the day, I still really like how this DIY patchwork blouse turned out. Seeing the colors come together and sewing the fabric strips together was almost meditative, and I'm tempted to try more patchwork projects in the future. So I really scaled down on my capsule sewing project this season, and with the completion of this patchwork blouse and this knitted puff sleeve top, I am done. I'm gonna spend the rest of summer enjoying wearing my recent makes, and I'm also gonna be putting together a video showing you all the different ways that I'm styling the pieces in this citrus-inspired summer lookbook. The lookbook contains a number of different things that I've made in the last couple of years, including this yellow dress that you've seen in this video. And if you want to see my sewing process from making this dress using a vintage 1960s pattern, check out this video right here. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!